All right, everybody. I guess we are live on the wide world web. So calm down and let's get started. Glad everybody's here. The rain has let up some, but let's start with a prayer. And our God and Father, we thank you for bringing us together this night, that we can share from your word and share fellowship and just being with each other, one another. Father, thank you for blessing us with all that we have and all the challenges we have. Father, be with those of our number that are dealing with issues from health to personal issues and strengthen them. Help us to encourage them too, Father. And also be with us with this lesson tonight and looking at things we've learned from the book of Esther. And thank you so much for your word and the example it is and the guidance it gives to us. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. So just for everybody, I'm the only one that it is 2 pages. I forgot to put one of 2, number them on there. But the first page says power structure in the book of Esther, and the other page is the second page. So I think they're all handed out in that order. As we finish the book of Esther, I've just done filling in for the month of June, and in the last couple of weeks, we've done just sort of looked at some of the personalities. Last week, we kind of went through Haman and Mordecai and just talked about, different things that they were from. We, talked of how they're both from opposing tribes way back. Haman was an Amalekite, and Mordecai is a descendant of Saul, and the Amalekites were supposed to have been wiped off the earth by, it was God's direction, and Saul didn't do that, and so here, it's still going on, and just some issues like that. And then before that, we kind of went over King Xerxes and how he was a descendant from Cyrus, who Cyrus was actually a very good, he was a great-great-grandfather of Cyrus, and he was we might say a good king. He did a lot of good stuff, and also he embraced religions, not just Judaism, but he was into all kinds of religions, so that kind of set the future of Persia to have a lot of different people. That's why the Jews were no longer, they were held slaves by Babylon. Xerxes, the descendant of, Cyrus, the descendant of Xerxes, was the one that set them to rebuild the temple and things like that. So there's a lot of, for a little book, Esther kind of has a lot of interconnections going back and going forward too, and all. But so tonight I thought we'd look at. I was going to try to just do some stuff on Esther and Vashti, and there's not a lot to go on. So I read some articles on some writings, I guess, and thought it might be interesting as some of the discussions we've had kind of talk about the power structure in the book of Esther, and the article I was reading, the author called it personal agency and consent, kind of authorization to work on behalf of and be able to make decisions, consent, and in Book of Esther, there's a personal agency and consent granted or withheld are related to power structures like in every society, and such as gender, social status, here are big ones. And the book of Esther contains a number of examples of consent, both refusal and acceptance, and other where consent is never asked. And in each case, the ability to give or deny consent is kind of due to social structure, who you are, where you're from. That's how you've got that ability to do that. But it's got a, as we've all read before, it's got a dramatic change in power due to the faith in God as opposed to the social structure. And, that really changes the dynamic on things. But let me ask you just some questions. I've got down here the 3 tiers of people. What are some I don't know if we, you could, if you see any others here or more detailed breakdown in the book of Esther, or even just in our life today. I like it when we don't just say those people, those days, but a lot of it's us people in our days too. But, so here, this author had given, we've got the common people. In the book, it would be like the men at the feast. They said the commoners were invited, which was kind of unusual, but the virgins were commoners. They had, and the commoners have very little choice or almost no choice in anything what they do. Then there's a group of people of importance, such as officials or royalty. And then of course you've got the king, who's like the ultimate worldly authority and stuff. But when you've read this, do you see any sub-levels or just some examples of kind of power structures, hierarchy in today's?
The only thing I would think is when you're looking at the book of Esther, one of the things that I thought about along this line was those secondary roles of like the servants, or the one who trained Esther, to present herself to the king. Mm-hmm. Did those eunuchs even ever really have any power? Or were they just servants with a certain role and responsibility, and they couldn't step on either side of that? And so I guess you would put them in with the commoners in a sense, because it doesn't appear as if they had any real power. They only worked within their lane, and if they probably ever got out of their lane, they would be called into account.
Right,
That's
yeah,
my
good
guess.
example of that, yeah. And I think they were, even though they had an important job, they were trained. Their job wasn't to make their own decisions. Their job was to act on behalf. And we see that there's some interesting, you had the guy in charge of it. I was just looking that up. It was the guy in charge of the harem was, what was his? What was he? Let me see. I'm going to find it here. You said it was that's the one I didn't write down, but I like that. That's special food. Esther. Haggai, Hegai, and so there were, his job. So he made some decisions, I guess, about things and all, but they were trained from, I think, a lot of those, much like in a lot of societies, both current and old, people kind of from birth they were determined what they were going to be. So these guys probably came almost like the tribes of Israel and stuff. Or even today, a lot of accountants kind of give birth to accountants, it seems, and lawyers seem to have lawyers, and stuff and all. I mean, not everybody, but farmers have farmers, and so it's kind of, but that's what they're brought up to do, so someone have, okay.
It's kind of interesting when you talk about power structures in our society the same way. You have that succession, like the carpenter has a son who's a carpenter, but it's not always that way, and sometimes people break out of their lane.
Yeah.
And the Bible's full of that. I mean, David was a shepherd boy. Next thing you know, he's a king. Yeah. Saul was a shepherd, and he was looking for donkeys when Samuel took him aside and anointed him. So with God, God's looking at the heart of the people. He was looking at the heart of Esther and Mordecai and these other people, and God shakes up the social order because he interjects things that nobody expects. Nobody expected Esther to get out of line and to actually be a person of influence, but she was. Mm-hmm. And David, nobody expected this boy to slay a giant, but he did. Mm-hmm. And so I see that in society now. I know people that are simple people, but they're good people, and God has raised them up in a position in their job or in their social structure that is way beyond what anybody thought they would be or what they themselves thought they would be, because God had a purpose for them. And you see that all the way through Esther.
Good. about anybody else? Any examples? Or how about in the church? Who's the big shots? Oh, there's George. Huh?
They get the most face time.
Yeah. But, you know, and that's it. If someone has a real problem, it's like, you know, who's the elders? Who do they go to, you know? And then there's some of the unofficial ones that are, you know, that serve and get stuff done. You know, the Mary Shadrachs, what do I say, you know, the group of guys that do the men's group, the ladies' Bible study, you know, the different things. And I think you're right with, in the New Testament, the new covenant, it's sort of, you know, we look at today with our standards and people will think, oh, it's, you know, it's sexist or it's this or it's that. And it's like, look at what it used to be. You know, I mean, sometimes we got to remind ourselves where we've come. I mean, one, I'm not saying it is sexist and stuff. It's not. I don't think at all. But when you start reading the New Testament, you've got more examples of women and different kinds of people being together instead of being apart and being separated. And you know, I think all this is, you know, all this is the foundation, the footwork that goes up to it. But so I tell you what, let's go ahead and read in Esther 1. We're just going to read about Vashti's refusal. And I'll just go ahead and read that. It's Esther 1, 10 through 12. And I mean, we all, I think, know the background, but Xerxes had thrown a big celebration. Then he'd been throwing a 7-day nonstop party, and he was what did I say here? He was impulsive. He was proud. He was selfish, womanizer, drunk. You know, and so they were having this party, and he even had all the commoner men of the community invited, which was, you know, never done. And they even put on the restriction. We talked this before. He told the eunuchs, the servants, give them whatever they want to drink. And they were drinking out of holy goblets, and everybody's getting drunk. And it used to be, if you've seen, I think I mentioned this because my experience with royalty is like PBS, you know, and watching, you know, Queen Victoria would take a bite of something, everyone along this big banquet would take a bite, and she'd put her fork down, and everyone puts their, that's what royalty used to be. And they said that's what usually is the case at these. The king would say they drink this, or he would take his cup, and they would pick up their cup and stuff. But this one was just a big bash, and of course he wanted Esther to then parade, show off her beauty to this crowd. She, meanwhile, had been doing the same thing with all the women in the kingdom, so she was no slacker herself. And of course, she refused. But let's see what it says here. It's on the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who had served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Horbona, Bigtha, Bagatha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. And earlier, the statement says that, let's see, he was King Xerxes, for a full 180 days, and this was part of that, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. So that's what Esther was like, the goblets that had been pillaged from the temples. You know, she was just another item to show off. There's a lot of scholars say, you know, it wasn't just that. It was like wearing the crown and only the crown, you know, all that kind of stuff. But she refused. It doesn't really say an exact reason. There's lots of speculation. But she was the queen. And what we see here is, as part of he sent his 7 eunuchs to deliver the message to Queen Vashti to come wearing your crown to this drunken party of all men, and you know, everyone's gonna oogle and ogle at you, and guys have been drinking for 7 days. There's nothing good gonna come out of those mouths for sure. So that's part of his pomp and circumstance. He sends his 7 eunuchs. It's no small event, but she refused, and there's a lot of things to say. She had some authority, not authority to run the king, but she did have the ability to refuse. They didn't. The 7 eunuchs could have dragged her in. They could have forced her to come, but she, because she was queen, probably one of the only people that could decline that request. And of course, she's going to have to. And you can be sure she, or I would say this, she understood the risks because she's grown up in this culture. It's no surprise that if she disagrees with the king, there's going to be some ramifications, serious. So, what do you? So why do you think the eunuchs didn't force her to come? And okay, I think you think of all those. I don't watch those shows, but what they say, Games of Thrones and all those big popular series that are like all this royalty. And this guy said if it was Games of Thrones, they would have speared her and dragged her in or something, But they are eunuchs. They don't touch the queen. They don't. He didn't. And I would speculate if he had said, "Go get the queen and drag her in here, whether she wants to or not," they would have done it. But at this, there's the pecking order. She's the queen. She's a woman, and when it comes to Xerxes, she's nothing. But when it comes to them, they're way below nothing compared to the queen, and everything. And and I don't know if how do you think? I think we talked about this when it was Esther being trained. But where do you think she got this knowledge of these things? Of the ramifications. She made a decision. She kind of must.
They trained her for a long time to be the queen. It's probably an educational process about what you're supposed to do and behave in these situations, and and they probably told her all about Vashti and what happened to her. So it wasn't done in a vacuum at all.
Right. Yeah. No. They've all learned that. It's probably almost like how there were a lot of things about behavior growing up that we weren't necessarily taught, but we observed, we learned because we saw other people. Our parents, didn't do some things, and when you're real little, you'd say, "Why not?" Or, and they say, "Well, because that wouldn't be right," or because they would arrest me, or whatever, and that kind of thing. But that's part of the thing. So she was empowered to withhold consent, even though she was the queen. And but I don't know if two things I thought of is if Xerxes himself had gone and said, "Come," would she have been able to refuse him directly, face to face? What do you think of that? Do you think? You're kind of a scholar, so I was looking at you. Any?
If there's a thought on Vashti, kind of like what Chris said, the only evidence we have of how they appointed a queen was to see how they appointed Esther.
Right.
So did Vashti go through the same process? We have no idea. Even historical records that tell us who Vashti is doesn't say necessarily how she became queen.
Yeah.
Kind of like how Solomon picked a queen. You're the queen, come on.
Yeah.
And so but yes, she would know the rules.
Yeah.
She would know that she's in direct violation of a king's order, and she chose for whatever reason. It doesn't say, she was having a party like you said. She's having a party just like he was.
Yeah.
So is she inebriated? Is she being defiant under the influence, or is she of the right mind? Maybe she kept herself, clear-headed enough to be able to make a decision. We don't know. We
Yeah.
just know that she said no, and the king did not like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And we also know that the king didn't make the decision what to do. He kind of went to his advisors, and they told him what to do.
Yeah,
So he was probably beside himself. But to defy the king, normally probably the penalty would be death. Because we see that with Esther and the reaching out the scepter. And, so there's some context there, but we don't know all
yeah,
of the story.
exactly, yeah. And that's what I think. If the king was actually there in front of her, if she refused, it could have been just put a sword through her or something. Might have been what would have happened or something. But clearly the eunuchs would have gotten in worse trouble than the queen if they would, even though the queen was defying, if they were to try to do something when they weren't told to directly do so.
That's a good point. It doesn't say what happened to the eunuchs,
No, I don't, but,
although there were new advisors, it appears.
yeah, so we'll see. And then, of course, I don't know if I just thought it was interesting in here, and it says he called this when he calls his advisors and stuff, and they really don't say it was illegal for her to do that. They say, therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the law of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the kingdom in the presence of Xerxes. And also let the king give a royal position to someone else. And then it says, and then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all the vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. And I couldn't find anything, but it almost sounds like maybe before that, maybe the women could talk back to their husband. I don't know. It wasn't against the law, but now it's against the law.
Well, he's making an example,
Yeah, definitely. But
and I don't think it works.
got some personal experience here.
I just don't think it works.
Not in
All I'll
public.
say about that.
Well, true. Almost every time, even now, even in any law that's meant to be for the good of something, somebody finds out a way to twist it and things like that. So we'll see. But okay, let's switch over. We're going to go to
That's like telling your teenagers, you're going to go and you're going to like it. Yeah.
yes, definitely. Okay, so we're going to go to Esther 3. Would someone read Esther 3, 1 through 6? You want to do that? Raise your hand so Matt can hand you a microphone.
Esther 3, 1 through 6?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him, and all of king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it has been when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage, but disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus.
So now we kind of see that culture of the Jews and the Amalekites, that hatred that had been simmering in the backgrounds for a long time coming forward. But we also see what is Mordecai's social structure level? What would you say? What's it say here? His position was, or
Well, he was some sort of a king's servant who were at the king's gate.
yeah. So I think he said that they use the term official. He's sitting with the other officials. I think maybe we had said earlier that he was like a judge. People would come with their problems, so which is almost some of the biblical way they do things, rather than everyone the king taking, all the burden, delegate some of this, these decision-making or these judgments to wise people. So, and it seems he was, to me, it seems like he was held in high regard. The other officials at the gate who were bowing were saying, why aren't you doing this? I mean, they seem to be concerned, why aren't you? And it really, something I read, they said, maybe Haman wouldn't have even noticed him. They kind of eventually had to report saying, one of us isn't bowing, but they seemed concerned to him. In my version it says, day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply, so they were trying to get him to, don't make trouble, and all that, but they didn't. But so yeah, he was an official, so he kind of had some authority. He wasn't denying. He wasn't denying the king, or he wasn't putting the king in a spot. It was his second in command, and whether they bowed when the king came through, I would assume so, or maybe that wasn't an issue, but he just knew. I think we talked before. He and Mordecai, he and Haman may have had some history, and he knew he wasn't a good man, or maybe it's just God, was working through him to, here's the time to start making a stand. Maybe, like we said, maybe the Spirit just moved him. Maybe he bowed to King Xerxes and everybody else that came through. We just don't know. It doesn't give us that. But at this time, he did. But again, Haman's higher than him, but not the ultimate authority. So Haman can't. Let's see. It's Haman couldn't run him through. Found out he's a Jew and said, "Well, here's a chance. Let's get all of them." Obviously, and so, but he couldn't. He had to go to the king about it, and since Mordecai was in that people of importance role, that the king would want to know why one of his officials was run through or something, and all that. So Mordecai was empowered to withhold consent, much like Vashti. She could withhold consent, but they're going to take, it's a great risk, and clearly he knew that. So he also used, Mordecai was obviously a man of God. He was thought highly of, and he used his, he had taken Esther in as like an adopted child, and he later on in the story uses his influence to her. Let's go to 4:12 through 14. I'll just read that one real quick. And this is when Esther then had heard. The eunuchs had gone to Esther and said, your stepfather, or whatever they called him, uncle, whatever, was not bowing. There's going to be trouble, whatever they were saying. And she sent him clothes. She sent them to find out why and all this stuff. And so when Esther's words were reported back to Mordecai, which were when she said, I haven't even been called by the king for a month. Anybody that goes to the king without being requested, could die. And so he says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. And this, to me, is one of those chilling kind of realization moments. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this. And this is where I think it kind of flips from, I've got this responsibility, everything's, going great, to, I'm going to have to do something about this. And sometimes we need someone to kind of hit us in the face, and wake us up. So, and so Mordecai used, even though just the power struggle, she's the queen, she could have told her eunuch to go report to the king that what Mordecai said to me, and the king would have done Haman's work for him. I have no doubt the king would have, how dare you talk to my queen that way? That wasn't, again, the authority stuff, it's just really, it's God working, obviously, but I mean, she could have just got her nose bent out of joint and said, and reported Mordecai, and he'd have been, something that, he would have been in as much trouble as, or more trouble than he was headed for. So, but Mordecai was such a man of principle, such a man of God, that he used his position, and I think we talked about this before, sort of sparingly or judiciously. He didn't, when people overstate their position is when people get tired of it. We've already passed, because we've talked before, the whole part about Mordecai already had saved the king from being overthrown or a threat on his life, and never asked for any recognition. He hasn't gotten any recognition for that. And he could have stood right there and done it then, but he's working through God. He's working a very, it's not me. To me, that's what I just keep thinking. He's saying, it's not me, it's God, even though they don't say that specifically, but I think that's sounds like the kind of guy he has. Anybody have any other comments about Mordecai or his position, or if he's in a pickle, or if he's in a...
I guess what trumps the king or your father?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, Esther had always been respectful of Mordecai.
Yeah.
So in this particular case, I think he was acting as a father to his daughter and not as a servant to his queen.
Correct, yeah.
Although, you're right, she had every right in her role to do something about that.
Right.
But he hit the heart.
Yeah.
He said, if you don't do it, it's just going to come from somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And it's going to be the end of your house.
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that there are people in our world that she was protected behind the palace walls, and nobody knew she was a Jew at the point, at that point. And a lot of people, most people, would have been tempted to say nothing, even though they would have watched the whole nation perish. They're like, well, that's their problem. I've got to take care of myself. And there are people that would have let the whole nation perish to just preserve their own skin.
Sure. Yeah.
And she didn't do that. She stepped up and did what a righteous person who cared about her countrymen and her people would do. But, this was an extreme situation.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us get fearful in the times when it's life or death, and you've got a sword pointed at your heart, so to speak. It's not easy to say, you know what, I'm going to do this. If it kills me, it kills me. If I perish, I perish. I just think that she was an amazing person for actually recognizing how important the situation was and being willing to take the appropriate action.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we can underestimate her character to do that.
Good point. Okay. And the next section I was going to get to, this is just titled kind of like the virgins, and including Esther, when we talk about the power structure. And in Esther 2 through 4, I'll get it here, just for our society, it's just so hard to imagine this. But then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This appealed to the king, and he followed it. And so again, this is when we said we had the commoners who have almost no choice in any matter. Add that they're women and they're young, obviously virgins. So they, besides there's a chance to be queen, what happens to you once you're in the harem? Anybody have any guesses or seen PBS or or Game of Thrones, whatever? I mean, are they? Did you raise your hand? I was gonna say they stay. I assume you stay in the harem, and you're still at the king's disposal, and probably anybody else the king sends, hey, head down to the harem and pick one out or something. So they were the chance of no, they didn't because of the time and the culture. They didn't have any choice in who they would marry. You know, their fathers were going to assign that, or their families and all that stuff. But they weren't going to be able to come back from this. They were gone. Yeah.
Well, it was tragic when you look at it that way for the girls, but the young men also were drafted into war and
Sure.
into armies, and they were picked for forced labor to do projects. There's references, even Solomon, that had that going on.
Yeah. yeah
God told
that
the
was the culture.
Israelites when Samuel when they wanted a king, that this was going to happen to them under their kings. So it was bad for the young ladies. It was bad for the young men. It was bad for anybody that wasn't the king.
Yeah.
And we forget how blessed we are in this free country to have what we have and the freedoms we have.
Definitely.
And the choices we have. And then we judge the people thousands of years ago for what they did under a completely different system.
Right.
And say, well, they weren't morally pure. Well, they didn't have a choice sometimes.
That's right. Yeah.
And so we need to realize that God saved them too, right out of that mess, just like he saves us, but it was a different mess.
Yeah, definitely. So, but yeah, and the kings in these words, they're saying no one was asked, they don't mention, there was never any question. They didn't have to ask the families, they didn't have to ask the officials in those areas, and definitely didn't have to ask the young people. And the terms, the verb uses taken, they will be taken. And even when Esther was selected as used, she was taken to King Xerxes. It's not like, so do you want to do this, Esther? And all. But again, they were going to be forced into that decision anyway, or they were going to be told, yeah.
And one of the things that in the research I did, they estimate her age was about 14 years old.
Isn't that
So
amazing?
This
Yeah.
this was still a child, I would think, 14
Yeah,
years old.
definitely.
Well, and we talk about the people and what they want to do. Who wants to say, oh, I want to grow up and be a eunuch?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
no.
Sign me up for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
True. Well, and I didn't put it down here, but if you've read any books, just think of this. One, you've got this culture of none of this individual freedom, individual choices, and we've got the children of Israel had been slaves in Babylon for, I forget what it was, hundreds of years or something. Even when they said they could go back, I think we talked about it in one of them, when they could to start rebuilding the wall, it was a small number that actually went back. They were used to being slaves, and they've got a lot of this. I read some things that talked about there were a lot of Jews were still slaves, but I guess a lot had become merchants and businessmen or officials or something. But if you've ever read some books on people in those cultures where no one has a choice, like I've read some stuff on North Korea, like when people escape from North Korea, a lot of them they come to South Korea and they get resources, they get money, they get job, because it's just to reacclimate. But a lot of them actually go back because they've grown up generations being told where to live, who to marry, what you're going to do for a living, what you're going to make. That it's more than culture shock. I mean, it's psychological trauma to suddenly you're sitting there. If you can imagine, you've got to make decisions about what you're going to eat every day, where you're going to go buy food. Everybody remember that Robin Williams movie, Coming to America? He played like a Russian musician or something, and he got over here to play a concert and said, I'm gonna, and he stayed with this family, a guy like a a security guard or something. Yeah, you can come stay with us. And he lived, you know, in like tenement in Harlem with like a, you know, extended family, you know, grandparents and, you know, all this stuff. But they said, oh, here, can you go to the store and pick up this stuff? And he like, it was like coffee. And he goes into the store and walks down the coffee aisle. You remember? And he's just looking up and down, and the list says, just get coffee. And there's like Maxwell House, chock-full, there's just coffee and coffee. In Russia, they stood in line, in the beginning of the movie, they show him standing in line for hours for toilet paper, and it just got handed to you. And he had a meltdown in the grocery store, and they're showing the ambulance, he's going in the ambulance, and everybody said, oh yeah, that happened to me when I came over from China, or that happened to me when I came over from, you know, if we've never had to we've been brought up to make those decisions, you know, to make a lot of choices. If you're brought up with no choices, and that's what these people, they didn't have them. So to actually get into a position where you can make decisions, like I said, at 14 years old and stuff, that's pretty phenomenal.
Years ago, I had a friend, and he was stationed in Russia that worked for my company. And the Russian government sets what the thermostats are going to be. And the thermostat in the apartment that he was in and had was like 54 degrees during the winter. And he couldn't, there's no way to turn it up or whatever. It's regulated by the government.
Yeah,
So,
and enforced.
And
See, ours is regulated, but it's not enforced,
he
you
said
know.
that he had his mother send him things like jars of peanut butter and tuna fish and canned meat and stuff like
Yeah,
that, because
yeah.
you couldn't get that stuff there.
Yeah. And you imagine when you go somewhere, if you leave there, there's just the day-to-day things you don't even think about. And this is sort of I think, culture, and this is, I think maybe for the hundreds of years, the Jews were stuck in that mode a little bit. And we can do that in our Christianity. We kind of get stuck in that mode. We're used to, you know, how many traumas have we heard about in the church of having a table up there for communion versus guys handing it out down the, you know, I mean, you know, coffee pot in the back or something. You know, I mean, they're important to people who that really bothers their conscience. But in the big picture, it's hard to sometimes, out of respect for those people, it's sometimes hard to get out of that. You know, that's what they've always known. You know, and so it's an issue to where, you know, to me, it's not an issue, and I say something dumb to someone who feels like it's very important, and that's not respectful either. You know, so we'll see. But
That's really a good way to look at that, too, because there are people in the world that have struggled with something, you know, because of their culture. They were raised thinking a certain way, and they've got a certain definition of what's right and wrong, and you may not have been affected by that particular thought process in your upbringing, so you don't understand why they've got an issue with that. And Paul, we talked about that in the men's meeting about Romans 14, about how Paul said, you know, if you were raised in idolatry, you may have a problem with the meat that was sacrificed to an idol, because you grew up your whole life thinking it was something important. And now, under Christ, we know that it's not. It's just meat. And the idol's nothing but a piece of wood. But to somebody that grew up in that culture and they were steeped in it, they might have a real problem there. And we need to be respectful of our brother who's not where we are on that. Don't use meat or those issues to divide the body of Christ and to cause somebody to be lost because you don't see it quite the same way. You know, we have to give each other some grace because,
yes,
you know, and that's where those things come from. We've got a lot of brothers and people in the world that have hang-ups about stuff that, you know, I might go, well, come on, get over it.
yeah, exactly.
But it's not that simple, and we need to be patient.
Yeah, and I think a good way to look at it too is, in some of those cases, we don't really have the authority to kind of like pass judgment. You know, and that's the hard, you know, we just have to keep our mouths shut. Sometimes better to say nothing than to, you know. Do no harm and keep your mouth shut. You know, so we'll see. But okay, well now I'm going to move on to Queen Esther's power of consent and agency. And you know, even though she was queen and she has eunuchs and maids, people clearly reporting to her or doing her bidding, she still can't approach the king without an invite, you know. But she took a risk, and she did a couple key things that show she just didn't barrel in there. And if you remember when they talked about when all the virgins were in the 12 months of preparation, Esther, they could decide what they would wear or bring into the meeting with the king. And they said Esther didn't do a lot. She did what the chief eunuch recommended, because he knew the king and all that stuff. And so she didn't want to show off. Others, I think it said, I forget how it described, but she wanted to go in there being who she was. You know, she wasn't going to put on a bunch of jewelry and makeup and whatever. And I think in this same thing, she's approaching this. She told Mordecai to tell all the Jews to fast and pray for 3 days, and she said her and her maids, I forget if she said her maids or her, you know, eunuchs, they would do the same. So she was only going to do it. All the people around her were going to know, if they didn't by now, that she was Jewish, and they were going to fast and pray with her for this, because they knew what the risk was too and everything. But you know, she didn't just barrel in. She knew the best way to approach it and all. And of course, we know, you know, he said whatever she wants, and again, she's got this selfish, egotistical. I mean, this guy, look, to me, maybe they have made movies of, you know, Haman's just like the corrupt, you know, nasty king. The more you read it, and she knows how, so she just wows him with her beauty. And what do you want? And he off the cuff, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. Did he really mean that, or is that just something he says, you know, or something? But he's so, I don't mean this incorrectly, so enamored by the physical and stuff. I'm sure this happened with anybody else that will happen to come by, you know. But so she says, we'll do 2 banquets. So she's like putting, you know, gonna put it out there. It's just like fishing. The bait's out there, you know, and he's nibbling. And she's gonna, which is part of the fun, you know, and all that. And so we used to say, I think I put down his, you know, we used to say, you know, sometimes if a girl flirted with somebody, say, well, she's just a tease. She's never going to do anything. And she's teasing them. She's bringing them closer to wanting it more and more. And he's just that susceptible because he's just so into his own needs or wants, you know, or something. But so she's clever. So she does it. And even Haman is kind of, you know, excited about it, but this thing that I was reading, the research brought up, but you know, she said, and we're getting low on time, but she said, I want to do a banquet for you and Haman, and the king says, go get Haman and tell him we're going to the banquet. Haman didn't have a choice about going. I mean, he thought it was going to be cool. He's excited about going, but even though he was number 2, he had no choice. The king said, we're going, you're going with me, you know, whatever. So it's just that, and of course more of they're used to that culture. But anyway, but then she used her shrewdness and dragged him around. And then we know, you know, the story. She told the king it was Haman was doing all this. And so suddenly the king's number 2 guy goes from being this great guy who he trusted so much that he could walk in and say, there's these people in your kingdom, I think we need to destroy them. The king doesn't even say, well, who are they? Who are these people? Which makes you wonder, he probably did that on a regular basis. I've uncovered this plot. I've uncovered this. Keeps being in the know, keeps being in the, you know, guy looking out for the king. So now he's gone from being that to he's trying to kill the queen. So that power has shifted suddenly fast, like a mousetrap going off Bing, you know, and then it says the king was so mad, and I'm just summing it up because he left the room and Haman was just pleading with Esther. He knew that's all he could do, and the king comes back and Esther says he's on the couch next to Esther, like prostrate, like, and the king's like, what, are you trying to rape my wife now after this? So, I mean, it's like goes from just a second, goes from being his right-hand man to not only trying to kill my wife, now you're trying to rape her, and it clearly wasn't what's going on, but it's nothing more. And then they and this is one where one of the eunuchs kind of spoke up, and he had said, there's the tower that Haman was building for Mordecai. How about it? I mean, that's now, or was he playing the right? Maybe he's playing his, but that I thought that was kind of out of character for a eunuch to speak up and say that. But and just says they covered his face and took him out. It was something else. So we got.
Mike, you just said it. I thought it was pretty keen on the eunuch's part. He knew what was going to happen next. So they just took the sackcloth and covered up his face because they knew he was going to end up on the gallows. And if you watch any hangings or videos of them, that's what they do.
Yeah.
When someone's hanged, they become their face becomes very distorted and garish. And even back then, I guess they covered them up.
Yeah, it's something. But yeah, it's just amazing. But it was this really is just, I don't know. It's just kind of interesting and kind of exciting to see how it plays out, and that it's really God. And like I think we mentioned before, then we talk about the king and the authority, but then we've got God who's over all this, God who's patient, God, and the children of Israel are like they're used to being slaves. They're kind of, and clearly God wanted them to. Has done it several times, want them to learn from their mistakes for long periods of time, centuries, but he's always there. And some of the scholars and all comment that God isn't specifically mentioned in this book, but he's there. It doesn't have to be mentioned. I had to look when I first read that because I thought, I'm sure there's God all over it, but it's and I've said that before, but he's the one that's kind of in all of this. So I mean, just think it's just, we like to say like back then they had all this, but many of these same power structures and stuff, like we mentioned, they're in play in some manner today, and we just have to keep reminding ourselves where our power comes from and everything. So anybody else have anything you want to add? One last thing?
The Bible says that the heavens declare the glory of God and the earth declares his handiwork. I think this book is just like that.
Yes,
You
I
don't
agree.
have, you don't have to have a sign fall from heaven saying God made this, but you look at the heavens and you realize it had to be made. It's too precise and it's too amazing. And I think that's the way this story is. This story has God's hand all the way through it. It's obvious to anybody that knows God that this was God. But you don't have to put a sign on it and say, okay, God did this for it to be real.
Yeah. And I think today, too, God works that way with us, too. We don't need God to say, yes, do that, no, don't do that. I mean, it's apparent in almost all cases. Yeah, Howard.
I just want to make a final point, if I can. In chapter 1, verse 10, when the king sends the eunuchs to Vashti, if you'll look at those names, there's a name that's consistent with being in the presence of the king. When you're talking about power and control, you don't have to be number 1, you don't have to be number 2, you don't have to be number 7, you just got to have the king's ear. Because if you look at chapter 1, verse 10, you see a name Harbona. See that? Now go back to, what was it, chapter 7? In verse number, what was the verse, 8, 9? Verse 8, as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, here's the gallows.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at the Bible, those things are everywhere. If you'll just pay attention, you're talking about power and control, because that's kind of what this has been about.
Yeah.
That's a good way to look at it. It's like if you're just at the right place and you're consistently a good person. When I say a good person, I mean someone that's dependable, even honorable, recognizing your position. You got a lot of power.
Yeah.
Harbona had a lot of power. And he was one of the eunuchs
Yeah.
that
yeah.
did the king's work.
Oh, good.
Just
Okay,
things like
good. All right, great. Well, that's what I have. I'm going to close this real quick with a prayer. Father, thank you for this night. Be with us this week as we go out into your world, your kingdom, and serve you, Father. Thank you for your word and the inspiration it provides. In Christ's name, amen.